Okay.
And the reason we're doing this talk today is because I can't do it next week. And the reason I can't do it next week is that I'm giving a presentation at the Franklin D. Roosevelt Library and Museum on the same topic, and that is the actual anniversary of what we're talking about here today, which is the beginning of national prohibition, which, you know, began, you said, January 17th, 1920, which I just learned recently. January 17th is the birthday of Al Capone. So how's that for fate? Al Capone was 21 years old when Prohibition came in. That was his birthday present. And so, but Prohibition was a long time coming before that. And there were like 3 waves of Prohibition sentiment. The first was before the Civil War. And New York even enacted Prohibition on its own in the 1850s. Maine was the first, and it seemed to be up and coming until this little thing called the Civil War. Got everyone distracted, and abolition and war and all that, and the steam ran out of it, and eventually just about most of the states repealed their versions of Prohibition. And then in the 1880s, 1890s, the Women's Christian Temperance Union gets going, and people are just saying, well, we'll take the pledge. And then other people say, well, there's not enough people taking the pledge, so let's shut these saloons down, okay? And why shut the saloons down? Generally, the people saying this were women, okay? Because their husbands would get their paychecks, cash them in the saloons, leave a good chunk of their money there, get liquored up, come home, be abusive, and they also bring something else home. Because the saloons were associated with things going on upstairs or the back room. So they might bring home a disease. And so for those reasons, and also because the saloons were associated with the political machines, the corrupt machines. In 1880 something, 11 of the 24 aldermen in New York City were saloon keepers. You know, so they were, and all the political meetings would be held there before primaries. So, you know, if you voted the wrong way, you might get a beer mug on your head or something. All right, and that is the era of Carrie Nation. The woman who would have a hatchet and go into the bars starting in Kansas and Ohio and smash the place up. And then she'd get arrested, and like the bootleggers later on, you know, you get arrested, but then you kind of walk out of jail. Nothing happens to you. And not too much happened with that second wave of Prohibition in the 1880s and 1890s. And then you get, you know, axes are good, hatchets are good, but you need a plan. You need an organization. And the Prohibitionists have an organization called the Anti-Saloon League. Okay, the saloon name was sort of poison back then in terms of public opinion. Saloons also were structured differently than what you might think of a bar and grill nowadays. They were kind of like Starbucks with beer, okay? Because they were owned by the breweries, okay? So you only sold this kind of beer in that bar. And I learned fairly recently where I grew up. I grew up above a bar in Amsterdam, New York. Actually, I grew up in the bar. I'm not kidding. And I found out that decades before that, before Prohibition, that bar that had been owned by a brewery in Troy, New York, Stanton's Brewery, which I had never heard of. So the Anti-Saloon League is formed around the time of this second wave, but it kicks in after the turn of the century when it gets a guy named Wayne B. Wheeler, who is this organizational genius. And what he decides is that he's going to be Mr. Single Issues Politics. So if you're the incumbent Democrat and you're for prohibition, he's for you. And if you're the incumbent Republican, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and he can swing maybe 10% of the vote each time. You swing 10% of the vote in the election, and you're the kingmaker. And he starts having more and more and more influence in the national elections. And by 1916, after the congressional elections come in, he says, we've won. We've won. We've got the majority in Congress, but it takes more than the majority in Congress to get something done with a constitutional amendment. By this time, a lot of the states now had statewide prohibition or local option. And in 1916, you've got something coming down the pike, which is called World War I. We're not there yet, but we're going to be coming in very soon. And the saloons were owned by the breweries, and the breweries were owned by Germans. Okay? Anheuser-Busch, Augie Busch, Schlitz, Pabst, Peels, Hendricks. You know, the great majority of them were, and they were tied up with, you know, support for the fatherland. They really were. And they were also getting involved in the suffrage movement, in the anti-suffrage movement. Okay? So you've got these two great movements, and they're kind of going together, women's suffrage and prohibition. Constitutional amendments kind of they grow in bunches like bananas. Okay? Think about it. You know, the Bill of Rights. 10, boom, all at once. After the Civil War, you abolish slavery, give equal rights and all that. And then the Progressive era, direct election of U.S. senators, again, getting away from those machine politics. The income tax and prohibition and women's suffrage all come in within about 7 years of each other. And also, you know, the old saying, the hip bone is connected to the thigh bone. So even more things are connected between World War I and tax policy. Think of tax policy, what I just said, the income tax, okay? Years ago, maybe you even remember it yourselves, we had to balance the federal budget. We don't even think of doing that anymore. But back then they did. And so you had basically 3 ways to raise revenue. I mean, you could cut spending too, but who's going to do that, even then? And one of them is the tariff, okay? And the other was excise taxes. Excise taxes on what? On booze, okay? This is going all the way back to the beginnings of the Republic, when, to raise money, the George Washington and his administration puts a tax on whiskey, and this leads to the Whiskey Rebellion in Pennsylvania. That gets put down, and that tax gets repealed. Wars cause taxes. So in 1862, the excise tax on booze comes up, and I've seen estimates where 1/3 or half of the excise revenue, or the revenue of the federal government as a whole, is coming out of taxing booze. So if you have prohibition, how are you going to pay for the federal government? Well, the income tax. That's come in, and then you can cut. You can no longer get money from booze, and you can cut the tariff. So all that is sort of tied in together, and when you get all those forces together, and there's another thing, we've got to support the boys overseas. We cannot be dedicating grain or alcohol or grains, wheat, things like that, barley, into making booze, hard liquor, anything like that. We've got to send this over to the people in the front, or our allies of France and England and starving Belgians, people like that. So for all of these reasons, liquor production the kibosh is put on it during World War I. Even before there is a 18th Amendment to the Constitution, booze is banned nationwide. So it's going to go through the Congress at this point. They're going to get 2/3 of the House and the representatives to vote on this. And there's, well, the 18th Amendment and the 21st Amendment, the comings and goings of Prohibition, both are unique in terms of how they're enacted. The Prohibition Amendment, they have a little thing in it. It says when it goes to the states, it has to be approved in 7 years. Okay? And that was kind of to put the kibosh on it, where maybe it's going to fail. And the Wayne Wheeler says, that's okay with me. That's okay with me. You can have that. And the reason is because time's running out for the prohibitionists. Even though they're winning, what's happening in 1920 is that the census is coming out, and America, for the first time by a very narrow definition, is now more urban than rural. Okay? And the urbans, the new Americans, the immigrants, the sophisticated Americans, don't want prohibition. The rural Americans do, but they're declining in terms of being a percentage of the population. So Wheeler is going to roll the dice and say, it's either the next 7 years or never before they redistrict again. And he wins, and it rolls through well within that 7-year period. And not only does it do it quick, it does it with overwhelming support. In 21 states, there are 0 votes against the 18th Amendment. This is one of the lessons of Prohibition and its repeal is how public opinion can change on a dime. Okay? All of a sudden, everyone's running in this direction, and then 13 years later, they're running in this direction. So it comes in, and Wheeler has worked with people to draft this amendment. And what's the amendment say? It says, it doesn't say we're going to ban liquor. It says we're going to ban the manufacturing, transport, and sale of intoxicating beverages. Intoxicating. Now this leads to problems in terms of enforcement because, well, how do you define intoxicating? Okay? Is it the hard stuff? Is it beer? Is it wine? And the argument is, well, you can't get too blasted on wine or beer, which I've seen evidence to the contrary, actually. But that is part of the argument, even though the old tax laws and such had a 0.5% definition, which was the same thing that the Volstead Act came into. So they were consistent on that, but it's going to cause problems in courts and things like that. And also that the fact that it's not illegal to drink. People think, well, it was illegal to drink. It wasn't illegal to drink. It wasn't illegal to have booze, okay? So the anniversary of the 100th anniversary of Prohibition is coming up, right now, but it was passed a year before that, okay? And they said in the enabling legislation that it would not go into effect for 1 year. So if you've got some cash in your pockets, what do? You stock up. Franklin Delano Roosevelt stocked up. I don't think Eleanor was too crazy about it, but he was going to, and some of the private clubs, at least one private club stocked up perfectly. They had enough for 13 years, okay? And so you could have this, you could have it in your home, and there was no law against drinking it, okay? Although the idea was to stop drinking, the law did not prohibit drinking. A fellow who was writing a history of the whole thing from a prohibitionist standpoint in like 1940 said this was the equivalent of banning the sales of deadly weapons but not murder. Okay, so the logic makes sense there of his description. Now, there were other loopholes, one of which is, you probably remember W.C. Fields movies, where he's saying, oh yes, for medicinal purposes. This was based on a real thing, where doctors would prescribe, where people would take a snort for medicinal purposes. A lot of the patent medicines, which women would take in the 19th century, were heavily alcoholic. So like Lydia Pinkham's, what Potions, whatever it was called, had like 22% alcohol. So great-grandma was like feeling good after a while. But you could, when Prohibition comes in and the Volstead Act comes in, which was to, you needed something to fill out the amendment. You just couldn't have the amendment. You had to control it in some way. And so it said doctors could prescribe booze for some ailment, whatever ails you, okay? And this was a powerful source of income for doctors. In 1917, the American Medical Association said there is no medicinal purpose for alcohol. But by 1922, they're saying, that limit you've got on the number of prescriptions we can write, why don't we take that limit off? Because they were getting $3 per prescription. They weren't even selling it. And to write the prescription, they were getting $3 prescription. And so the pharmacists were also making money on this. And if you go to a doctor and you say, "Doctor, it hurts here," and I think if I exercise this elbow, it won't hurt as much. And if he says no, well, you're just going to go to another doctor, and maybe you're just going to stay away permanently. So a lot of doctors were in that business. The pharmacists did want to get out of the business, even though the American Medical Association was just like seeing the dollar signs with that. Now, also, the lady beforehand was saying how her father would make wine in his basement. You could make up to 200 gallons of wine a year. It kind of started as a sop, shall we say, to the farmers, because they wanted their hard cider. Okay, so that was illegal, and the manufacture of wine in homes was legal for home use. But again, this would get twisted in the bootlegging racket. There was a group called the Jenna Brothers. I think there were 6 of them in Chicago. And what they would do is they would put the arm on the Italian community there, and everybody was making wine constantly in their homes, and then they were taking it out and selling it. And that was illegal. There also had been provisions in the law to padlock illegal, immoral places for a while. So if you were running a brothel or something, and the cops shut it down, they could shut down the property and padlock it so the landlord would not be able to use it to rent it out for another year, which made the landlord sort of like an enforcement, bureau. This was kind of thrown out the door with Prohibition, and you couldn't do this as much. You could get off with the posting of a bond for like $500 or $1,000, which doesn't mean you paid $500 or $1,000. You just bought a bond, which unless you were caught again, wasn't going to amount to anything. In New York, a gangster named Arnold Rothstein found another loophole in the law, or one of his lawyers, which is if the feds or someone raided the place and found nothing, they couldn't raid it for another year. So guess what? There were all these raids where nothing was found, and they knew they were coming. So for all of the, and also the initial penalties of the Volstead Act were very low. You might get up to $500 fine and 6 months in jail on the first offense. But there were no minimum penalties. So you might walk away with a very minimal fine, no jail time. And also, a lot of these guys who went into it were, they weren't innocent before Prohibition. They were thugs and guys running protection rackets beforehand. So Oni Madden, Oni the Killer Madden, had served 7 years in Sing Sing for manslaughter before he gets out at 22 and starts running the big breweries in Manhattan. So what's 6 months to these guys? Nothing, if they even get it. And the big guys don't get it almost ever. But then there is one guy who gets caught and serves some time, and his story is really, really very interesting. His name is George Reeves, and his story ties in to that medicinal alcohol thing. He was born in Germany and came over as a kid, was orphaned, was sent to work with his uncle, who was a pharmacist in Chicago. And he becomes a pharmacist, and then he gets bored with that and becomes an attorney. And as Prohibition comes in, he's defending some of these early bootleggers, and they're paying off the fine. They just walk into the court, they pay the fine, and they walk out. And he's like, wow, I'm on the wrong end of this business. Okay? So he decides to get into the business, and being a lawyer, he knows the legal loopholes, and he knows the pharmacy business. So you would get a lot of the booze, which was still in distilleries and bonded warehouses, and he would get the licenses, in many cases forged, to get the booze out. He was also bribing a close friend of the Attorney General of the United States to get these permits. And this close friend, whose name was Jess Smith, had promised this fellow, George Reeves, that nothing would happen to him. Don't worry, nothing will ever happen to you. But Smith gets nervous about whether he's going to continue in this business. And one day, he shared an apartment in a hotel with the Attorney General of the United States, Warren Harding's Attorney General, and he blew his brains out. Now, this removed the protection for George Reeves. He goes to Atlanta Penitentiary. He was like the Great Gatsby, by the way. If you go to he moved to Cincinnati, and if you came to his house, he'd have a big party, and maybe the ladies would have diamond watches under their plates when they left. Everyone could take a diamond watch, or a car. A car. There'd be a line of cars, and you'd get it. So he was living well, but they bring charges against him, and much to his surprise, he's convicted and is sent to Atlanta Penitentiary. While he's gone, the Prohibition agent who had sent him away takes up with his wife. And she strips him of every asset he has while he's gone. He comes home and he finds his house literally empty of furniture. So they're going to be divorced. He sees her driving to the courtroom, and he orders his driver, pull her off the road, force her off the road. And he does. He gets out of the car, pulls out a gun, and blows his wife's brains out. Now, one of the things which Reeves had pioneered in when he was still a lawyer was the insanity defense. So he defends himself and argues that his client is insane. And the jury, which, many of these juries were sympathetic to these bootleggers and such, was certainly sympathetic to a guy who had been treated so lousy by his wife, his second younger wife, by the way, okay, his former secretary, and lets him off, although he then does have to go to an insane asylum, where he argues that he is now sane and is let out. So that's a story of George Reeves, but eventually they do increase the penalties for Prohibition violators. Now, the fellows who are going to enforce this law, they don't hire a lot of them, and they aren't very good. There's 1,900 miles of coastline in this, around America, and they hire 1,500 agents to control that and everything in between, and they pay them about $45 a week. So figure it out. Yeah. They're going to be on the tape, and many of them are. They're also not civil servants. They're patronage employees. So you've got a lot of things can go wrong here, and they do. Many of these guys are forced out, and they don't go to become civil servants until 1929, when it's very late in the game. But among the first guys they hire, among the first guy is a guy named Izzy Einstein. He had been born in Austria-Hungary, came over here, and was working in the post office in 1920 when Prohibition comes in, and he sees that they're hiring, like the Census Bureau, we're hiring. And he's 5'5", and he's really like this. He looks like a sack of potatoes or pickles or whatever. And they say, you don't look like a Prohibition agent, he says. That's why I'm going to be good, because I don't look like a Prohibition agent. He also spoke like 6 or 8 languages, coming from Austria-Hungary. So he could mix with people, and he really does. He brought in a friend of his called Mo Smith, whose background was he was a couple inches taller and even heavier, and had worked at a cigar stand. That was his qualifications. Izzy and Mo had a conviction rate in New York City, where nobody was interested at all in enforcing the law, of 95%. They arrested 4,932 bootleggers, okay, and destroyed 4 million gallons of booze. Now, sometimes, he would knock on the door of a speakeasy and would be wearing a uniform of a Prohibition agent, and it's like, hey, that's a good gag, and he'd say, yeah, I even got a badge here, and the bartender said, where'd you get that badge? And he says, follow me, I'll show you. And he was under arrest, or he would make arrests even where they had pictures of him behind, on the wall, like, watch out for this guy. But he was a master of disguise. And of course, being the most successful Prohibition agent in the history of Prohibition, he was fired in 1925 because he was getting too much publicity, and they were jealous of him. Speaking of in the history of Prohibition, the Prohibition movement was it could have been a worldwide thing. It could have been a contender. Every province in Canada had voted by direct referendum for Prohibition before we had. That's one reason why we thought we could control the border, but there was this guy named Bronfman, and he eventually made Seagrams, and so the stuff flowed across. And England and Germany didn't have Prohibition during the war, but they restricted sales a lot. In 1914, Tsar Nicholas bans alcohol in Russia. Bans alcohol in Russia. It was kept a ban until, I think, right around the time Lenin died. It lasted until the 1920s. Norway had it. Sweden just missed by that much of putting it in 1922. And of course, the Muslim countries had it then, and about a dozen of them still have it now. So it looked like it could have been a great movement. Now, Izzy and Mo were at the beginning of Prohibition, and at the end of Prohibition, we've got a guy better known than them now, Eliot Ness, the complete opposite of those two guys. He's a college man. Izzy and Mo are middle-aged. Eliot Ness is 26 when he's put in charge of getting Al Capone. Now, Chicago was one of the reasons why people turn on Prohibition, aside from they wanted to drink, was violence, okay? And Chicago is the most violent place for all of this stuff. There's like over 400 unsolved gangland murders in Chicago during Prohibition, which of course, unfortunately, translates into a lesser murder rate than in Chicago today. I'm not kidding, okay? But so, and the murder is often high profile. So Chicago, or Capone moves to Chicago with a guy named Johnny Torrio. They wipe out the leader of the gangs in 1920 called Big Jim Colosimo. In 1924, a rival non-Italian gang shoots Torrio in the face, like boom, but he survives. And he gets out of the business and says, Capone, it's all yours. Remember what I said, Capone was like 21 years old when Prohibition started, so he's like 25, 26 when he's starting to run all of this stuff. And the murders of people who are opposed to Capone, the Dion O'Banion, who owned the flower shop, and he was killed in the flower shop in like 1924 or so. Then there's another guy named Jaime Weiss, who was shot on the streets of Chicago. The bullets, you can still see the pock marks at the Holy Name Catholic Cathedral where he was shot. Okay? Jaime Weiss, by the way, was not Jewish. His name was Henry Wojciechowski. And
Polish.
Yes, one of the rare Polish gangsters. And then another Capone rival is Bugs Moran, who is not Irish. He's French. I don't know why these guys are hiding their identities. But so Capone, allegedly, no one ever proved it, no one ever proved anything, right? But this is in 1929, you have the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, which is a bunch of Moran's guys are awaiting a shipment in a garage on the north side of Chicago. A car pulls up with some guys in police uniforms and then some other guys with them, and they say it's a raid up against the wall. And then these fake policemen mow these guys down. And they're photographers, and you can see pictures to this day. It was just, I think somebody said, at this point, the game graduated from murder to massacre. And it's